everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice, and today we're talking about the legal name fraud and how to participate within a matrix construct system, a legal system, an economic system, a financial system, which appears to kind of to take your soul and bind you into it and give you, little green squares in return, known as Federal Reserve notes, aka US dollars. Right? How do you survive in a system like that while still retaining your soul? I feel like this is a topic that I can probably speak on better than probably, I don't know of any real YouTubers on the planet right now who can probably have as coherent a message on this topic, because really hardly any of the people on the planet even know that this, structure even exists. And it's basically, just to get into it, so the crown, the essence of the topic is that the Crown Corporation, right, not like the Queen of England, right, the Crown is essentially the owner of the City of London, right, and there's three crowns that have been set up, one in the Vatican in Rome, one in the City of London, and one in Washington, D.C. These are each jurisdictions. These are districts that were set up within their host country, but they are not a part of the host country, and they are the Triple Crown system. And this is essentially the structure of the Empire of the West, right? All the Commonwealth nations, all the, the Five Eyes nations, pretty much everything except for, some of the BRICS nations. And this is kind of the gray area of the conspiracy, which, we'll kind of get into here in a second. But the Triple Crown, essentially through the Crown of the City of London, owns essentially all birth certificates as intellectual property, right? So your birth certificate, which contains the name that was printed, the name that you were given at birth, is basically Crown copyright. And it's in capitis diminution maxima, which basically means all capital letters, and which is the text type, right, the print type for corporations, right? So your name on your license and on all legal documents is always in capital letters, because that is the corporation that has the same name as you, the living person, right? So you, the living person, right, have a name, right? So let's just say, for the purpose of this video, Mango Thunderslice, even though that's not my legal name, right? Mango Thunderslice, the natural person, is not all capital letters when it's written down. It's, it's a proper noun, so the first letter is capitalized and all the rest are lowercase. But if I were to write Mango Thunderslice in all capital letters, that kind of the signification of that typography is essentially, this is a corporation. This is a entity. And so, in English common law, right, they're kind of the natural person is really what's at stake, and what is the focus point, right? The legal system didn't originate so much, on computers and in digital databases and, even on the paper realm. It was really adjudication between natural living persons. And this is the basis of the justice system, the legal system, in its, functional, beneficial form. And it's, that form of legal system should always exist, right? Our great goal here is to return this matrix-based system closer to something like that. However, we live in a different world now, and we can't exactly go back to living off the land, and thereby we can't exactly go back to, the law of the land and English common law. There's something about the world that we live in, and the world, seeing the world as, a ship essentially moving through the sea of space, right? There is a sort of appropriateness for maritime admiralty law, which is the law that governs corporations, right? And so we live in a system where all of us are being judged by maritime admiralty law and the law of corporations, right? Code, statute, legality, right? Very different and distinct from lawfulness and, constitutional law, so to speak. And whether or not something's lawful is different than whether or not it is legal. And, there's all these different little codes that we are expected to abide by, and not all of them are always in compliance and in conformity with, right, the Constitution, as we're well aware, right? You can be doing something illegal when it comes to, modifying your firearms, But under the Second Amendment of the Constitution, is it lawful? It's like there's myriad different conflicts between what is legal and what is lawful. And, there's always going to be a little bit of conflict because the states under the American founding, the states are supposed to decide, at least have some latitude to decide under the 10th Amendment. But there are certain things which they're not supposed to infringe on. The First Amendment, right to speech and free assembly, and to petition the government for grievances, right? And then the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, right? Regardless of whether or not you're in a militia, for the purpose of maintaining a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? But realistically, all the private citizens who hold firearms are the militia. So if you own a firearm, you are basically the militia, as they would have considered the term back at the American founding. Not necessarily you're part of the modern militia movement, which has, of course, been roundly demonized and excoriated by the mainstream press, unfairly so. If anything really were to happen in the SHTF scenario situation in this country, right, the militias, would be one of the most prepared groups, and people who were part of a militia would definitely be in an advantageous position. Because what one person can do with a gun is a small fraction of what even a small, effective group of people can do with guns, right? In an offensive or a defensive situation. Just ask, U.S. Special Forces, right? What a few people with some big guns can do who are working part of an effective team, right? And similarly, defensively, a few well-trained, citizens who know the territory in which they live could easily defend it against any occupying force. I don't care how good the Chinese satellites are. You can't scan an entire continent and analyze all the little nooks and crannies and little, valleys and defensive, defensive points, I guess, defensive positions within the geography. And so it's why, again, the Japanese general is often quoted, right? There's no way anybody could invade and hold America. There would be a rifle waiting behind every blade of grass. And so people in this country, they are naturally very free and as a result very powerful. At least that's the way it's been. And so we're at, again, a crucial moment in history when we have to decide which way we're going to go. Socialism in the global model, or, economic nationalism and populism, right, under the American model and the American founding. And so, through successive constitutional amendments and, certain acts that were enacted, right, the advent of the Central Bank and the Social Security Act really changed the game a lot, changing the currency from gold to, Federal Reserve notes changed the game a lot, and now everything's been digitized. So it's like our legal name is very much a part of not just our courtroom interactions, but even literally our social media. So enter Mango Thunderslice, right? This is how I got into all this, because, back 7-8 years ago, this was very much what I was looking into, and, this is kind of the apex of the conspiracy of the legal system, I guess, if you will. There's the energy conspiracy, and then there's the legal conspiracy, and they're pretty much entwined, because the power, electrical power and spiritual power at the core foundation are ultimately still just activation of the ether, and they're fundamentally the same power. And so, if you keep people spiritually in the darkness, you can keep them electrically in the darkness as well. Because, again, the sovereign will find the nature of sovereignty, right? He who, controls the fountain, will understand the source of the water, right? And to use a little bit of an enigmatic metaphor. But so, we are capable of producing everything in this world. We are the fountainhead, right? As Ayn Rand, wrote a book about, the fountainhead is he who is basically connected with his mind and with his innate faculties, who is basically connected with the universe and the resources therein, and creating basically entirely new worlds every single day. And that's the nature of creativity. That's the nature of man's destiny on this planet, and what he is supposed to be doing every single day if he is in his rightful place. And so this is really the question of how did we become divested from that, and what is the way to find our way back. And one of the ways that we're held back is through the financial debt-based monetary system, where essentially all money is loaned into existence and the interest is expected to be paid back from the principal, and essentially it's a constant extraction of real wealth, not paper wealth, not dollar wealth, but real hard tangible assets and real wealth from the people of the country to basically the extractor class, right? The owners of the commercial banks, and more importantly, the owners of the Federal Reserve System and a central banking cartel. Who everyone can kind of speculate who their identities are, but it is technically a secret, a very well-guarded secret. And there's a reason that even an audit of the Federal Reserve has been shot down, like a Russian warplane every time it's appeared, from Ron Paul and then Rand Paul. It's just, we're going to really have to have a mental and spiritual revolution in this country before any sort of meaningful reforms like that are possible. And even in the collapse situation, the collapse scenario, right, we still, if we don't perform the groundwork and, lay the foundation for that new world, then the world that is likely to spring up out of that cataclysm and that collapse is likely to be just as bad, if not worse, than the world that we're living in right now. So for the people who just think it's just about accelerationism and collapsing the system, and then they'll have the opportunity to get what they think matters to them, well, I would encourage them to think twice and to really play out the scenario and to understand that chaos rarely makes things better unless you basically are in control of the chaos, if you're the eye of the storm. But, this is really where we get into the what I used to consider no man's land, but it's the arena. It's the only place where change can be effected. You might think that the entire system is bullshit, and you would probably be right in a lot of your justification. And that's sort of irrelevant, however, because you were born into this world, right? You did come through the birth. Your ship did enter the dock, and or at least the dock slapped your bottom and gave you a little, wristband and, some injections and handed you off to the nurse, right? The birth and the dock. It's interesting how the English language sort of alludes to the nautical aspect of this world and of existence. And so when you're born, essentially a corporation is created, an account is created with the crown of your name that your parents give, and when you file for a social security card, you're essentially creating an account within the central banking system, and that account is essentially, as the story goes, I haven't worked within the Crown Corporation or seen any of this myself, but as the story goes, it's loaded with a certain amount of essentially pre-created, money, and just sort of, it's the base account from which the central banking system operates. And this is actually, regardless of whether or not I've seen inside the Crown Corporation, this is a fact that the Social Security system and the income tax are premised on the human stock, the human population of the country. We are the collateral for the national debt. Let me say that again. We, the American people, are the collateral for the national debt, right? So when the United States government issues treasuries and borrows money, it is on basically its ability to pay back in the future. And what does that come from? It comes from us, the tax cattle, right? The human stock, right? So effectively, we are the collateral. We are the asset underlying the loan transaction, which happens at the central bank level. And so, depending on your background and your family situation, there's a variable amount that each account gets loaded with based on how much, they expect you to make in your lifetime in terms of economic output and productivity. And so there's a massive amount of wealth that is on the back end of the system. And so we get essentially the trickling out of just this paper asset. And by the time the money gets to us, though, it's already gone through, dozens and dozens of other hands and parties. And so by the time it gets to us down at, the general, common man level, that dollar has already lost essentially all of its purchasing power. It's at its weakest and most diluted point by the time it gets to you. And this is known as seigniorage, right? And a very high up controlling person in the academic mind control program when I was in university came and gave a talk about global currencies. And, he, he basically wrote in giant capital letters on one whiteboard on one side of the room. He wrote two words, one on each side of the room, one of which was control and the other which was seigniorage. Seignorage, seigniorage. And basically this is the principle that the person who has first and closest access to credit creation derives the greatest purchasing power and benefit and value therein, right? So the closer you are to the fountain, right, the cleaner water you get, right? Just like, you're drinking water downstream, who knows how many have peed in it, right? And that's the same with money, right? Seigniorage is being close to the fountainhead. It's being close to the credit creation and getting the maximum value from it. It's easiest to acquire and it has the greatest potential at that first issuance. And so the people who can create money at a whim, right, fiat money, that's exactly what it means, and it shall be, just like fiat lux, let there be light. It's fiat cash, let there be cash. And so they basically can create money to acquire real wealth, and this includes land, it includes assets, it includes equipment, it includes resources, but primarily, yes, it means acquiring control. It means doing whatever you need to do in terms of controlling resources in order to get control over the domain. And they have done that quite well, I would say. They may not be good at everything, but they're definitely good at being, greedy little sniveling bastards. But not to editorialize too much, but I think everybody's in agreement on that point. Right, that these people are not exactly benevolent rulers of the species. Maybe there is a role for a true aristocracy, of a true benevolent elite. I think that capitalism in its beneficial form allows the greatest of our species to rise to the top and to benefit personally in proportion to their providence and to the world, of what they can do in service to their fellow humans. And I think that's a good system at its core. I think that what we have is a system that has exploited and perverted certain aspects of that system, has manipulated the unit of currency, has manipulated the unit of measure underlying the entire economic universe. Imagine, if you will, if they just said, we're going to change the length of a meter. Just because it's more convenient for us if we can just change the length of a meter. It'll make all of our buildings and our dicks seem bigger if we can just change the length of a meter, right? The number of units goes up if we take the value of the unit and we reduce it, right? And so that's essentially what they're doing with money, and it's not helpful to anyone except those who hold massive amounts of debt. And so it's very much a perverse, cycle of basically the people who are borrowing massive amounts at the most beneficial rates and then basically demanding that the currency get hyperinflated to benefit the creditors and basically, monetize the debt and just run out the clock essentially financially. And so nobody actually has to pay the piper. Everybody just keeps getting paid by the Fed. And so now we're at the end game of that stage where it goes, parabolic. And so, basically where they already had the fire hose on, now they literally broke the handle off and it's like a goddamn horizontal geyser coming out of this thing, and, she's about to blow. But what that means is modern monetary theory and socialism, right? Modern monetary theorem, the purpose of it is to underpin infinite deficits and, ongoing deficits, which is the basis of socialism. There's no reason you would run perpetual ongoing deficits unless you had a massive sprawling central state that was taking care of all kinds of things that, in previous times it wouldn't have taken care of. So modern monetary theory, again, illustrating the two worlds and the two paths that we have in front of us. And so I guess the reason that I'm bringing up the legal name fraud, it is very much a pinnacle to solving this system. As long as we're thinking inside of the system, we will not solve the equation. We will not be able to find our way out of it. And, a commenter on the video before last where I, It's titled WTF, Atlanta cop charged with murder of Rayshard Brooks, right? Where I thought it was pretty much a no-brainer that, basically Rayshard Brooks, based on his actions of firing a deadly weapon at an officer of the law, kind of deserved to die for that action. It's not a moral judgment of his character, but just to say that, if you choose, it's called the type of suicide. It's right, but I forget what it's called. But when people actually attack the cops because they don't want to shoot themselves or hang themselves, it's a form of suicide when you attack the cops, because everybody knows what's going to happen if you shoot at the cops. They're going to shoot back, and regardless of how good a shot they are, depending on the police department in Atlanta, maybe they're pretty good. But they're gonna turn you into Swiss cheese, right? Everybody knows that. Regardless of whether or not you think DUI laws are legal or not, or should be abolished, right? I'd probably agree with you that DUI should be abolished. This particular commenter on the video was asking, what is a crime? What is a court? What is resisting arrest? And, his point was that essentially Rayshard Brooks was not committing a crime. He had harmed nobody, and therefore, basically he shouldn't have been killed, right? But that's kind of a two-dimensional way of looking at the situation. And, again, I would agree that DUI laws should probably be abolished. I'm totally not in alignment with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I don't really agree with any group that starts with mothers. Not to say that mothers are generally wrong, but politically active women who use the emotional basis of their motherhood as the shield on which they're pressing forward, I guess on the vaccine issue, it serves as an effective shield, but that's an actual crime that's being committed on a mass scale, and we're supposed to pretend like it's the greatest, achievement of medical science. It's actually, a subtle form of genocide. And then there's, DUI laws, which, driving drunk does, admittedly hurt a lot of people, but until you actually hurt somebody, you haven't actually hurt somebody, right? So the laws are premised on the likely endangerment and harm to people in the community, and their responsibility and authority to protect. So the question is, right, are you prepared to live in a society where people take the consequences of hurting others, and we don't take, preemptive warfare against them, preemptive action, and take them off the streets, right? And that's an open question. And, if you really want that to change, you're going to have to convince your countrymen, because right now most people support DUI laws, even the people who've had DUIs. I mean, I feel like in general people support DUI laws, and they don't want just, drunk and drug-addled people out on the road all the time. But again, I would favor, again, the states being able to decide, which they already are, and I would favor those laws changing. But the moment that you fire a deadly weapon at an officer of the law, you're asking to die. You are literally saying, please, sir, please shoot me and kill me. And that's exactly what Officer Brooks did. And he was justified to do so. I thought that was a no-brainer, but apparently it was very controversial, and many subscribers didn't exactly agree. But it's okay, because the reason I made this channel is so we can have, vigorous discussion that is otherwise proscribed by the usual suspects: Facebook, Google, Amazon, or not Amazon, but Twitter, all the others, all the ones I'm banned from. So anyway, I got banned from Facebook because I was using it under the name Mango Thunderslice, and then eventually I was posting about the legal name fraud. It was literally right as I started getting heavy into posting about the legal name fraud, and then they banned me. And they banned me under the premise that I was using what was it? It wasn't even it was that I was using a common word as a name, and that basically it was going to lead to confusion on the platform, which is hilarious because I know at least a dozen people in my friends and extended family who are using not exactly their legal name on Facebook, and no action has been taken against them. Hilariously common words, but apparently I was the nail that stuck up, if you will. So they said, you're going to have to provide valid state ID for Mango Thunderslice, otherwise, basically, sayonara, champ. And, essentially, so I wrote them back and I responded to their robot, pseudo-human, basically something written by Kate of Gaia, called I who shall not be with legal name, and essentially describing the fact that basically the Crown Corporation owns all of the legal names via the birth certificates held as intellectual property, and that if you use your legal name, you're essentially committing fraud by creating joinder with a piece of intellectual property that you do not own. And so essentially every time you register something or you act under the legal name, you're essentially committing fraud and placing yourself within the jurisdiction and, chopping block of the matrix and its controllers, so to speak. And in a sense, that's true. But the real crime of the system is not exactly the creating of that account and the basically creating of that, or corporation with your name. It is that people don't understand the difference between the natural person and the straw man, right? They don't understand the difference between the natural person and the legal name. They think they are their legal name. And when you start to really identify with your legal name, you become an egoist. You become basically a worshiper of titles and social status and paper money and, all the things that basically, when Christ said the love of money is the root of all evil, it was the egoism that people who are very attached to their legal name exhibit, right? All those false trappings of wealth. I truly believe in wealth. I love wealth. I love money, but I love it for the things that it can bring that are of true godly, divine value. The land and the water and the air and the food that is pure and, having a roof over my head for my family. And, ideally soon we'll actually own the land and the building. Right now we're renting, but this is kind of the thing. In finding the truth, really, the goal is just to bring people back into that state of communion with nature and with sovereignty and connection to the natural world, connection thereby to the Creator. And so basically I was in a little recreational debate with this commenter, about how, essentially Rayshard Brooks, yes, you are a natural person and the law of the land is relevant in, some aspects and capacities, but also you are a citizen, a stakeholder of several different layers of corporation, right? If you live in a city, if you live in a county, if you live in a state, you are basically citizen, stakeholder of these corporate entities as well. And your natural rights under English common law don't always play in, right? You are a corporate entity. You are a sailor on that ship, so to speak, and you have responsibilities as a passenger on that ship, just as if you were a passenger on a ship across the Atlantic. You would not just be this nameless creature, this animal, right, grazing off the land. You would be a passenger. You would be part of the, the list of passengers. You would have a name, and you would be accountable for your actions on the ship, because if, worst case scenario, you do something that sinks the ship, right, you're accountable to the people on it. It's not the same as when you're on land. And those same principles apply to the corporate entities in which you are participating. And this is the thing. If you want to basically say everything using your legal name is fraud, and basically, you can't even buy beer because you won't get a driver's license, and you have to explain to every person at the liquor store that basically you will not be with legal name and commit fraud, then by all means you go do that and see how far you get trying to convince the average Joe Schmo, that basically the Crown Corporation even exists, let alone, owns all of our names as intellectual property and controls us all via the central banking system. If you like to do that, if that's fun to you, by all means, I encourage you to live the life that you find fulfilling. But for me, that all seemed like a very giant waste of time in very short order. So I decided, essentially what I did is I reset my whole life, and I basically took out all the false trappings of wealth inside my own psyche, and I basically just reset my life. Space Panther and I basically got married. We left our hometown of Reno, and we lived in our van, and we traveled the West Coast, and eventually, reset my life, and we were on our way out of this country to buy land in another country. And eventually it seemed that the Creator and this country and this planet had other things in store and other ulterior purposes for us, and I am not meant to leave this country just yet. I have a duty and a destiny to fulfill. And so that is essentially what my video today is about, is you've got to find out what your destiny is and you've got to fulfill it. You can't run away and say that everything's a fraud, and that basically because everything's a fraud that you're not going to participate in it. At a certain point, becoming a man, growing up, you've got to understand that, you got to make compromises in wartime, right? And life is a war. And, what you can do by being an effective citizen stakeholder of those different corporate entities is you can affect change. You'll find that the layers of opposition that you thought were insurmountable are actually fairly feeble in the end. And ultimately, you need to use your legal name. Hold it in your hand like a hammer, like a tool, right? Like a gun in a sort of sense, and a weapon. And don't see it as yourself, see it as a tool that you and yourself holds to use for its own purposes and its own constructive or destructive ends. Because again, you have free will and you have latitude in this universe. And so that's essentially my video about the legal name fraud. It's important to be aware of the system that controls you, but it's also important not to be controlled by the narrative of the system controlling you, right? It's important to stay free in your soul and in your mind and in your body. And so that's really more important than, staying in a purity spiral, about the legal name and not using it, right? I am Mango Thunderslice as far as you guys are concerned, and as far as my soul is concerned, and staying out of the matrix, right? But I do have a name that I was born with, and it's very important too. And I use it in its proper context, and that's essentially what it's supposed to be used for. And so that's my video today. I hope you guys have a good one. A little bit longer, but this is a big topic that could, go on for a long time. And half an hour is not too long to give you that much sovereignty in your life. So anyways, hope you guys are having a good one, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.